Hello, nice to meet you. We come now to part 3 of fractures of forearm, wrist and hand. In this group we have fracture scaphoid bone, dislocation of lunate bone, dislocation of carpal region, sprained wrist joint and fracture of metacarpals and fingers. First we remember the practical anatomy of the hand. The carpal bones are 8 bones. First one scaphoid, second lunate, the third one triquetrum, and pisiform, trapezium, and trapezoid, capitatum, and hematum bone. We have also 5 metacarpal bones and 14 digitus of the 5 fingers. We should also remember the names of the fingers, the 5 fingers of the hand, the thumb, then index finger, middle finger, ring, and little finger. We should also be aware about the functional position of the hand. This is to be considered by reduction of fractures, by evaluation of injuries, by immobilization techniques and open reduction and turn fixation, and also by functional training in the rehabilitation and physiotherapy training. This is the functional position of the hand. Let's also have a look on the anatomy of wrist bones. We have 8 bones which are very important to be considered in the treatment of fractures. And here we see also the anatomy, the X-ray anatomy of wrist bones with the names illustrated. Very important to remember. And here another X-ray view with the names of metacarpals and carpal bones. Now to the scaphoid fracture, which is very important fracture. The treatment of this fracture is difficult, and we know that it results from forcible radial deviation of the carpus. The waist of the scaphoid is fractured by being pinched between the radial styloid and capitate bone, as we see here in this illustration. This X-ray view shows a typical fracture of the waist of the scaphoid bone. Here we see the other type of scaphoid fracture, a fracture of the tuberosity of the scaphoid bone, resulting from a direct blow on the thenar eminence, as you see in this illustration. By the treatment of scaphoid fracture, we should remember that the typical scaphoid plaster of Paris cast, the POP cast, should include the wrist joint and also the first metacarpal bone joint of the thumb. The thumb should be immobilized for at least 12 weeks, means 3 months. Now to another problem in the wrist joint, the lunate dislocation. This bone, the lunate, can dislocate resulting from a direct blow by forced dorsiflexion of the hand associated with median nerve injury, very common, and a vascular necrosis of the lunate bone, which is common. So remember, the lunate bone dislocation needs a special X-ray view, lateral X-ray view, and it looks like this illustration. Here is demonstrated the lunate dislocation. The dislocated lunate bone appears at the volar aspect of the wrist joint. If we dorsiflex the wrist and hand, so the lunate bone, which is dislocated, will appear at the volar aspect, and the X-ray view shows the complete dislocation, as we see here. Now to the metacarpal region. We should remember the anatomy. We have 5 metacarpal bones. Every one is deviated in 3 parts: the head, body, and the base. A typical metacarpal bone fracture is the so-called Ronaldo's fracture. It has a Y or T-shaped fracture of the base of the first metacarpal bone. Often it requires open reduction and internal fixation. We know 2 forms of the fracture of metacarpal bone base. Number 1, the fracture of the first metacarpal bone base. The one is Bennett fracture dislocation due to sport injury, as the left figure, and the second is fracture through the base of the first metacarpal bone, the right figure. To the fracture of metacarpal head, the fracture of metacarpal neck of the displacement, and we should know that the distal smaller fragment, as we see here, is displaced to the palmar side of the hand due to pull mechanism of the flexor tendon. The small fragment is pulled to the palmar side of the hand. This is the way how to reduce the fracture of the metacarpal head. We see the same fracture during the method of reduction and flexion of the metacarpal joint. We flex the finger so that the small fragment of the head of the metacarpal bone will be reduced in correct way. And now to the fingers. We have, as we know, 5 fingers. Each one has 3 parts, except the thumb has 2 parts. So the other fingers have distal phalanx, intermediate phalanx, and proximal phalanx, except the thumb has 2 phalanx or digits. The treatment of finger fractures. First, we have the method of strapping and fractured or injured finger to its neighbor finger. This is a method which is very successful unless we have an open injury. So we should know also that it is useless to apply plaster of Paris cast, POP cast, by finger fractures. We see very common failure in the casualty that some people apply plaster of Paris cast in case of fractured finger. This is not correct. And another failure is the fixation of the finger in plaster in extended position. Never fix the fractured finger in extended position, otherwise you will have problem to mobilize the finger later after 1 or 2 months. This is a common failure. So the correct way is to fix or immobilize the finger which is fractured or injured in a flexion position, in a functional position. Here we see a Böhler's finger splint to immobilize the injured finger in flexed or functional position. This is the correct way. Always fix the finger or immobilize the finger in flexed position, never in extended position. At the end of this group, we should remember that the correct management of fractures of the forearm, wrist and hand is the best way for a successful rehabilitation of the hand injuries. This is very important. So this was the end of the part 3 of fractures of forearm, wrist and hand. Thank you for your attention, and we meet maybe by another talk about another topic in orthopedic surgery. Thank you.